Hey friends, what's up? And welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf 6 of Masechta Yevamos. Friends, what do you want me to tell you? Daf 6 is also another Geshmak Daf. For now we're just focused on this question of how do we know? What? Did somebody just send me like a message or something? Don't they know that I'm recording Babylon Talmud? Anyways, so what were we saying? That we, all the way from the beginning of the Gemara, we've been assuming that, how do I say this? How about this? What am I even talking about? Okay, fine. Well, all of this whole Yibum thing with these arayos is learned out from the sister of your wife, right? That is not allowed, and it's not allowed from a gezerah shava, meaning obviously it's not allowed, but even in the context of Yibum, it's not allowed because it says aleha by Yibum, and it says aleha by sleeping with your wife's sister, and therefore the point being that even in the context of Yibum, it is still not allowed. Now, of course, the assumption being that if I would not have that gezerah shava, I would assume that it is allowed. And the question is, why would I assume that it's allowed? So, because of the construct of Ahsay dokhe lo ta'asay, that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment, that the positive commandment of Yevamos aleh would override the negative commandment of don't sleep with your wife's sister. And therefore, I need the gezerah shava to teach me that do not say Ahsay dokhe lo sahsay, and rather you would not do Yibum when it's your wife's sister, and then we apply it to other arayos as well. Now, then the Gemara started saying, okay, now how do we know this concept of Ahsay dokhe lo ta'asay? How do I know that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment? We ended up essentially learning it out from tzitzis, but then we asked, but fine, tzitzis overrides shatnez, but shatnez is just a regular mitzvah lo sahsay. How do I know that an Ahsay even overrides a lo ta'asay when it's a lo ta'asay that has karis associated with it, such as sleeping with your wife's sister? So that is where we're at. How do we know that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment when that negative commandment has kares associated with it? And that's kind of where we are right now. Without further ado, friends, we're on Daf Hey with Beis, about 6-7 lines to the bottom. Elo, rather, itzrich, we need the gezerah shava of aleha to teach me that do not do Yibum when it's your wife's sister, because sakadate chamina, I may have thought to say teisi mikibud of va'im. Because I may have thought to say that Ahsay is dokhe a lo ta'asay, even when we're talking about a lo ta'asay that has kares associated with it. I would learn that out from kibud va'im. How? The Tanya, as we learn in the Brisa, Yochol yehei kibud va'im dokhe Shabbos. Is it possible that honoring one's father and mother would even override Shabbos? Talmud lomar ish imo v'aviv tirov es shabsoset tishmoro ani Hashem. That a fellow should fear one's father and mother and guard my Sabbaths. I am God. Kulchem chayav b'chvodi. Everybody is obligated in my honor. So the question is, right? Of course, there's a commandment in the Torah that one must honor his father and mother, and one must fear his father and mother. And therefore the question is, what if one's father and mother advises one to be Mechal Shabbos? The Gemara is about to explain what exactly is the father or mother requesting of the child. But the question is, okay, what happens now if there's this conflict? On the one hand, the Torah says that one must honor and fear their father and mother. On the other hand, one must also not do malacha and be Mechal Shabbos. So what do you do when those things come to a head? What do you do when your father or mother, tells you to be Mechal Shabbos? So it says, right, again, Ishim of Aviv Tiro, Veshabsos Tishmaro, Ani Hashem, Kulchem Chayav Bechvodi. everybody is obligated in my honor, i.e., do not, right, i.e., the mitzvahs Ahsay of kibbud av v'em is not dokhe, the mitzvahs lo ta'aseh of lo sahsay kol melacha, of don't do any melacha on Shabbos. So, right, so, I mean, you might think that, well, kabed es avicha v'esimecha, honoring one's father or mother should override Shabbos. And therefore, the pasuk says, Ishim avav v'tirov v'shabsosa tishmo ani Hashem, that kulchem chayav mechvodi, everyone is obligated by honor, and do not listen to your parents in that case. My love. What are we talking about? To Amrle, shachod li bashali, that we're talking about a situation where one's parents, mamish, ask him to do an av milacha that he's chayiv kares for, such as slaughter an animal for me, or cook for me. These are avos milacha that one would be chayiv kares for. And we're saying, do not listen to your parents. V'taima the kosav achmonas shabsosai tishmoru. Now, how come you should ignore your parents in this case? Because we specifically have a verse that tells you to do so. Because the pasuk says, "Shabsosai tishmoru ani Hashem." Everyone's obligated in my honor. Don't listen to your parents if it's to be Mechal Shabbos. Halavachi, but if we wouldn't have that pasuk to teach me that, dokhe, I would say that you would listen to your parents. Meaning, the default would be that if one's parents, which is mitzvahs Ahsay, right? Kabed es avicha v'esimecha. If one's parents instructed one to be Mechal Shabbos, I would assume by default that you should listen to your parents. Ahsay dokhe lo ta'aseh. That the positive commandment of honoring one's father and mother would override the negative commandment of lo sahsay kol melacha, would override the negative commandment of don't be Mechal Shabbos. That would be the default. To say that Ahsay is dokhe lo ta'aseh, even in a place where there's a chiyuv kares like Shabbos. Now comes the pasuk to say, to teach me that, wait, hold your horses, do not listen to your parents. But short of that pasuk, if we wouldn't have that pasuk, then the default would be that I would listen to my parents, because we would say, Ahsay dokhe lo ta'aseh, even when the lo ta'aseh has kares associated with it. Friends, what do you think of that? Friends, we're really using our whole body over here in order to study. A Gemara like this, you don't just use your head. You use your whole body. Your whole being gets involved. It's like the Gemara says at the end of Masechta Chagiga, right? That it says, what does it say? Aloko dvar ke'esh nu'um Hashem. That the Torah scholars, their entire being is fire. Friends, our entire beings right now is fire. A Gemara like this just takes your whole being and makes it fire. Friends, we're moving on. Lo, the Gemara says, no. It's not talking about slaughtering and cooking on Shabbos, which are avos melachos that you'd be chayiv kares for, lav de mechamer. Rather, we're talking about a lav of mechamer. Who can tell me what mechamer is? It's escorting a donkey that is laden with stuff. That on Shabbos you're not allowed to escort a donkey that's laden with stuff. However, you're not going to be chayiv kares for that. It's a lav. We'll beat you up. We'll whip you. Hopefully you won't do it again. You'll learn your lesson. But you're not chayiv kares. It's a lav. Don't do it. Don't escort your animal. But it's not a chiyuv kares. And therefore, it's not a proof to say, right, the default, right, so we're talking about a situation of mechamer, where it's just a lav. It's not like slaughtering or cooking, where it's actually chayiv kares. It's an av melacha. No, we're not talking about that. We're simply talking about escorting a donkey that's laden with stuff, and it's just a lav. And therefore, yes, the default was that I would assume that I should listen to my parents to escort this donkey, because Ahsay is dokhe lo ta'aseh, just a regular old lo ta'aseh. Therefore comes the pasuk and says, no, even that don't listen to your parents because, everyone's obligated in my honor. But we do not have any reason to say that an Ahsay would be dokhe lo tasay that has a chiyuv kares associated with it. In fact, the Gemara, v'afilu achi lo dachi. 1 second. But if we're saying that the pasuk of Kibbut Av V'Eman in the context of Shabbos is talking about mechamer, well then, why would we say to ignore your parents in that case? Even so, we would say, afilu achi lo dachi. And even so, we would say that the Ahsay of Kibbut Av V'Eim is not dokhe, the lo ta'aseh of mechamer, of not to be mechamer. But Ella, the kaimelon, the asi ese v'dachi lo sahsay, ligam me'achad de lo lidche. But 1 second, if we're going to say that when your parents say, hey, be mechamer on Shabbos, and the Torah is saying that you're not allowed to do that, so wouldn't that be a proof that Ahsay is not dokhe lo ta'aseh? Right? If we're going to say that that's talking about mechamer, this seems to be a proof to say that here you have a case, mitzvah Ahsay, and a regular lo ta'aseh of mechamer, and we're saying don't listen to your parents, that the Ahsay is not dokhe the lo ta'aseh. So then shouldn't this be sort of a proof against saying Ahsay is dokhe lo ta'aseh? Of course we've been assuming up until now that Ahsay is dokhe lo ta'aseh. But if we say that this pasuk in the context of Kibbut Av V'Eim on Shabbos is talking about simply mechamer, which is a regular lav, and we're saying that you have to ignore your parents, that the Ahsay of Kibbut Av V'Eim is not dokhe the lo ta'aseh of mechamer, well shouldn't this be a proof against the concept of Ahsay dokhe lo ta'aseh? Wouldn't this be proving that Ahsay is in fact not dokhe lo ta'aseh? Oh, friends, what do you think? But maybe you'll say, wait. Maybe it is talking about mechamer, and we're saying ignore your parents. So in this case, we're saying Ahsay is not dokhe lo ta'aseh, but that's because it's Shabbos. Shabbos is very, very stringent. It's on its own sort of level. We can't learn out other things from Shabbos. Meaning, in general, we would say that Ahsay is dokhe lo ta'aseh, but on Shabbos, where things are more stringent, so an Ahsay is not dokhe lo ta'aseh. But ve'atana ba'ama koi v'lo kaparich. But 1 second, I can bring you a proof from a different case where we seem to have no problem learning out from Shabbos. And we don't seem to be saying, well, Shabbos is more stringent than everything else. We're not saying that in the following case that we're going to bring. So therefore, we have no reason to assume that that would be the case here. And therefore, if we would say Ahsay is not dokhe lo ta'aseh on Shabbos, so then I should ask that Ahsay should not be dokhe lo ta'aseh in general. The Tanya is we learn in the Brayso, Yachol Amalo Aviv. Oh, if a fellow's father says to him, he tamei, or she'amalo al tachzir, Yachol Yishmalo, should you listen to him? This is the context of Ashava Saveda, returning a lost object. Right? Let's say this fellow is a Kohen, and his father says, he tama. Right? His father says, look, there's an iPhone. It's in a Beis HaKvaris. It's in a cemetery. Go and become tamei in order to chop the iPhone and return it. Now, it says by a kohen, the nefesh lo yitama be'amav, that don't become, right? It's a lo ta'aseh. Don't become tamei. But his father is saying, become tamei. O sha'amar lo al tachzir. Or if his father says, don't return the lost object, and the pasuk says, lo sucha l'salim, you're not allowed to hide from it. So it's a lo ta'aseh. So Yachol Yishmalo, should you listen to your father? I.e., you have the Ahsay of Kibbut Av V'Eim, you have the lo ta'aseh of the nefesh lo yitama ba'amav, or lo sucha l'salim. So Talmud Lomar, ish imo v'av tiro v'shabsosa tishmo ani Hashem, that you have to fear your father and mother, but you also have to guard my Shabbos. I am God, kulchem chayvim b'chvodi. Everybody is obligated in my honor. I.e., we see that Ahsay is not dokhe lo ta'aseh, and we don't seem to have any issue with saying like, oh, but Shabbos is more stringent. That doesn't seem to be the case. Rather, we seem to be saying simply, Ahsay is not dokhe lo ta'aseh, and therefore, do not listen to your father when he says, don't return the lost object or become tamei in the cemetery. So says the Gemara. Okay, fine. So one second. Okay, we seem to be having a hard time arguing that it's the lav of mechamer, right? Meaning, where are we? Basically, we're trying to prove that, how do I know that in Ahsay would be dokhe lo ta'aseh even when there's kares involved? We say, well, in the context of Shabbos, we say that I need a special pasuk to teach me that I need a special pasuk to teach me, do not listen to your parents if they tell you to be mechal Shabbos. But by default, I would assume that I would listen to my parents, i.e. that Ahsay is dokhe lo ta'aseh even in the context of chil Shabbos, which is a chiyuv kares. To which the Gemara says, no, but it's talking about the lav of mechamer, which is only a regular lav, so it's only teaching us that the default will be that Ahsay is dokhe lo ta'aseh when it's a regular lo ta'aseh, but not a lav that has a chiyuv kares associated with it. But then we asked, but if that's the case, then wouldn't that be an argument to say that we would not say Ahsay dokhe lo ta'aseh from the fact that on Shabbos, even by regular mechamer, even by regular lav, we're saying don't do it? And essentially we said maybe Shabbos is too stringent, but we said that's not really the case. So back to the question, so then mistama, it's not talking about mechamer, because if it was talking about mechamer, which is a regular lav, then it would sound like the Ahsay is not dokhe lo ta'aseh. Because we're saying that you wouldn't listen to your parents in this case, even though it's an Ahsay. So rather, we go back to our original way of thinking, which is that it's talking about shachot li basheli, that one's father says, slaughter for me on Shabbos, cook for me on Shabbos, i.e. a chiyuv kares, right? A lav that has kares associated with it. And we're saying, don't listen to your parents because we have a pasuk that says don't listen to your parents. But by default, I would think that the Ahsay of kabedes avicha v'esimecha would override the lav, of cooking or slaughtering. I would assume by default that the Ahsay would be dokhe lo ta'aseh even though there's a chiyuv kares, and I need a pasuk therefore to tell me don't listen to your parents. But the Gemara says, but still it's close but no cigar. That eina chinami, that shachot li basheli, slaughter for me, cook for me, is a lav that is a chiyuv kares associated with it, and we're assuming that by default I would say that nonetheless Ahsay would be dokhe lo ta'aseh. However, it's a little bit different in that if your father says to you, slaughter for me an animal on Shabbos, well, you're kind of in a pickle to the extent that the only way to do the mitzvah Ahsay, to listen to your father, would be by slaughtering the animal. Your father says slaughter the animal. The only way for you to be able to do the mitzvah Ahsay of kabedes avicha v'esimecha would be to listen to him and slaughter the animal. So the mitzvah Ahsay and the mitzvah lo ta'aseh come together, and therefore in that case the default is that since there's no way out of it, that if I want to honor my father, I have to slaughter this animal. So therefore, because they're kind of intertwined, the default would be that I would say that Ahsay is dokhe lo ta'aseh and you would listen to your father. However, in the context of Yibum, where there's a way out, do chalitza. So kilu, you have the mitzvah Ahsay of Yevamos yavo aleh, but you have the mitzvah lo ta'aseh of sleeping with your wife's sister. And in this case, just do chalitza. There's a way out. It's not like, well, I have this mitzvah Ahsay of Yibum, and I have this lav, and I'm stuck because I have the Ahsay, but by doing the Ahsay, I'm also doing the lo ta'aseh. That's not the case here. Just do chalitza. And therefore, I cannot necessarily assume that even though the default by kibbud av v'eim, when your father tells you to slaughter an animal on Shabbos, even though the default would be that Ahsay is dokhe lo ta'aseh, that's because you're kind of in a tight spot in that by doing the Ahsay, you have to violate the lo ta'aseh. But when it comes to Yibum, just do chalitza and avoid the whole situation. So I would not necessarily say that in that case we would assume by default Ahsay dokhe lo ta'aseh. Now, in fact, the Gemara, a similar line of thinking, Yochli binyan beis hamikdash dokhe Shabbos. Maybe I'll argue that the construction of the temple would be dokhe Shabbos, because after all, it says, what does the pasuk say? V'asu li mikdash. Make for me a temple, which is a positive commandment. But of course, there's also lo sahsay kol malach, which is the negative commandment on Shabbos that has a chiyuv kares associated with it. So here we have an essay and a lo sahsay that has a chiyuv kares associated with it. And what are we saying? I would have thought to say that. Well, maybe let's learn it out from the construction of the temple. The Tanya, as we learn in the price. So is it possible that the construction of the temple would override the holy Sabbath? Talmud Lomar es shabsosai tishmoru mikdashi tirou ani Hashem. Therefore it says, guard my Sabbaths and fear my temple. I am God. Everybody is obligated in my honor, and therefore, even though there's a positive commandment, a positive commandment. What did I say? Commandment? That's interesting. A commandment. All right, friends, we're not going to stick with that though. We're gonna do the traditional word, which is commandment. So even though there's a commandment of Asuli Mikdash, and that is a positive commandment, and there is, lo sahsay kol melacha, don't do melacha on Shabbos, which is a negative commandment that has association of kares with it. So even though there's an Ahsay and a lo ta'asay, nonetheless, we do not say that Ahsay is dokhe lo ta'asay in this case, because we have a pasuk that says, Shabsosay tishmoru mikdashi tirou ani Hashem, that everyone's obligated in my honor, so do not construct the temple on the Sabbath. Now, my lab, the bone of a and let's say that's talking about building, destroying, things that are avos melacha, things that you'd be chayiv kares for. And the reason why you're not allowed to construct the temple on the Sabbath is because it says, guard my Sabbaths. But if we didn't have that explicit verse, dokhe, I would say that Ahsay dokhe lo ta'asay. By default, I would say Ahsay is dokhe lo ta'asay, and even construct the holy temple on the Sabbath, even though there's a chiyuv kares of doing malacha on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, no, lav de mechamer. We're talking about the lav of escorting a laden donkey, which is just a regular lav, and that's why we would assume by default Ahsay is dokhe lo ta'asay, but it wouldn't apply to something like binya bona v'soser, which has a chiyuv kares associated with it. Certainly we would not say Ahsay dokhe lo ta'asay by default. V'afilu achi lo dokhe, but in fact the Gemara, if we're talking about just escorting a laden animal, that's only a lav. We're saying that by default the Ahsay would not be dokhe lo ta'asay. Ve'ela dikaimelon de'asi essay v'dochi lo sahsay ligmor me'achad lo dochi. But in general we say, this is the same flow that we had earlier. In general we say that Ahsay is dokhe lo ta'asay. If we're saying that you would not even be mechamer on Shabbos for the Beis HaMikdash, which is a mitzvah's Ahsay of Asuli Mikdash, and nonetheless still do not be mechamer on Shabbos, so that would beg the question of, well, maybe we then don't say Ahsay dokhe lo ta'asay. And if you're going to say yes, but even though by Shabbos we say don't do mechamer, that's because Shabbos is particularly stringent. But one second, there's another case where the rabbis, where a brisa seems to be learning out from Shabbos and doesn't have an issue with it. It doesn't seem to be concerned that maybe Shabbos is particularly stringent to Tanya. As we learn in the brisa, for example, if somebody's father says to him, become tameh to return a lost object, or he says don't return the lost object at all, yachol yishmalo, is it possible you should listen to your father? Tamuloma, therefore it says ish imov av tiro v'gomer. It says, honor your father and your mother. Kulchem chayav b'chvodi. Everybody is required in my honor, right? Meaning from right, we learn out in the context of Shabbos that you would not listen to your father in order to violate Shabbos. So we see that over there we're learning out Hashavas Aveda from Shabbos, and we don't seem to be concerned that, well, Shabbos is particularly stringent, and therefore, if we're saying that don't even be mechamer on Shabbos and constructing the temple, well then shouldn't that be an argument to say that Ahsay is in fact not dokhe lo ta'asay? So ela mishum dika lemifrach malanach shkin hechsher mitzvah. To which you could say no. So it is talking about boneh and soser. However, even though the default would be that I would be able, right, that the asay of the Ahsay Mikdash would be dokhe delot asay of Shabbos, and therefore you would be able to be boneh and soser in the temple on the Sabbath. But nonetheless, that's talking about because in order to construct the temple, I need to be boneh v'soser, right? There's no way around it. So there's no way around it, as opposed to Yibum, where there is a way around it. So even though by default the assumption would be by the temple that the asay of Ahsay Mikdash would override the lot asay of doing melacha on Shabbos, but in the temple, that's because the asay and the lot asay kind of are intertwined, which is not the case by Yibum, where you can always just do chalitza and then you can avoid the whole thing. And therefore maybe I would say that by Yibum we would not say asay is dokhe lo ta'aseh, where there's a chiyuv kares and you could just do chalitza. But hechsher mitzvah tepukli mihasam. But 1 second, we should learn out the whole hechsher mitzvah thing from ignoring your parents on Shabbos, right? Because we said that the kabedes vicha v'esimecha and slaughtering an animal or cooking when your parents tell you to cook for them on Shabbos, that is sort of intertwined. So we learn out from the example of honoring one's parents on Shabbos. That is where we learn that the concept of these things being intertwined. So therefore, in the context of building the temple on Shabbos, I don't need that to teach me the whole hechsher mitzvah thing, because I already know that from kibbut av v'em on Shabbos. So eno chinami, the Gemara says eno chinami, but still, we would not learn out from here that asay is dokhe lo ta'aseh even when it's not intertwined, because, right, which would be the situation of Yibum, because what do I learn out from the pasuk of guard my Shabbos and fear my temple? It's required for the following brisa. Is it possible that a fellow would be fearful of the temple? Well, therefore it says guard my Sabbaths and fear my temple. It says guarding on Shabbos, and it says fearing in the context of the temple. Mashmir amura b'Shabbos, just like when it says guarding Shabbos, lo mishabbos atimisare elamimisha hizra ala Shabbos. You're not scared of Shabbos. You're scared of he who warned you about Shabbos, i.e., you're fearing God. Afmora amura b'mikdash, also the fear of the temple. Lo mikdash atimisare. You don't fear the temple. You don't bow down to the temple. You don't, right? It's not the temple that you fear. Ela mimisha hizra ala mikdash, rather for he who warned about, who instructed about the temple. Okay. Ve'ezu himora, what is fearing? Ve'ezu himora mikdash, what is fearing the temple? Le'yikonis adam b'harabais b'makelo b'minalo. A fellow should not go into the Temple Mount, right? We learned this in Masechta Brachos, with his walking stick, with his shoes, b'pundaso, with his fanny pack, uvavok shal gabi raglav, or with the dust that's on his feet. V'yasenu kapandria, he shouldn't make the Temple Mount a shortcut. V'kika mikavachomer, and also we learn out that you don't spit on the Temple Mount, right? From kavachomer, from the fact that it says in the Megillah Taka, it says Kein lavo el shara melech belvush sak, that you don't go to the gate of the king in sackcloth, and memelif in sackcloth you don't go. Certainly you're not spitting over there. Hakin lugis. Ve'ein li elo bizman shmis mikdash chaim. I only know this at the time that the temple exists. Bizman she'ein bis mikdash chaim minayin. How do I know that even when the temple does not stand still? Don't walk on the Temple Mount with your, with the dust on your feet and your walking stick and that stuff. Therefore it says, guard my Sabbaths and fear my temple. Ma shmira amura b'Shabbos la'olam, afmura amura b'mikdash la'olam. Just like guarding the Sabbath is forever, so also fearing the fear that is mentioned in the context of the temple, that is eternal. So So, what do we see? So, what we learn out from this pasuk of Es Shabsosa Tishmar Es Mikdashi Tiro Ani Hashem. So we learn out about how one should sort of act and relate to the temple in terms of showing fear of God when at the temple. So therefore, it is not going to teach me that Ahsay is dokhe lo tahsay in the context when there's karis and also there's a way out. We cannot learn out from there because we need to learn out from that pasuk about how one should act on the Temple Mount. So still, we are in search of a proof to tell us that a positive commandment would override a negative commandment in the situation where the negative commandment has karis associated with it, and there's kind of a way out of it, such as by yibum, you can always just do chalitza. So how do we know in that case? Still, we would assume that by default, Ahsay would be dokhe lo tahsay, that we therefore need the gezeira shava of alea to tell me, wait, do not do yibum in that case. The Ahsay, don't assume that Ahsay is dokhe lo tahsay, rather do not do yibum because of this gezeira shava. So the Gemara now goes on to give another suggestion. Ella, rather, Sakadat Techamina, I may have thought to say, Tesi me'avar. I may have thought to say, well, I could learn out from kindling. Alright, let's see. Titan Dever Bishmal Stad Besmedish of Bishmal, Los Sevayesh B'chomosh Vosechem. Do not kindle a flame in wherever you live on the Sabbath. Matam Lomar. Why does it say don't kindle a flame on the Sabbath? Matam Lomar. What do you mean? Why does it say that? Ilu Reb Yossi lelav, ilu Reb Nosson lechalik. I don't know, friends. Of course, you remember the machlokas from Masechta Shabbos. Havara lelav yotzos or havara lechalik yotzos. Right? Of course, the pasuk says lo sahsay kol melacha. Don't do any activities. Don't do any work on the Sabbath. So then why does the pasuk need to say lo sevayu eish b'chomosh v'seichem? Why does the verse need to say don't kindle a flame? Don't do any melacha on Shabbos. Why do you have to point out specifically don't kindle a flame? What's special about kindling a flame? So it's machlokas Reb Yossi and Reb Nosson. Reb Yossi says havar lelav yotzos. That is to teach me that, well, whereas by all of the other melachas you'd be chayiv karis, by avara it's simply a lav, you get malchus. Whereas Reb Nosson says lechalik. That Reb Nosson says, well, it's not to think that you'd only be chayiv if you do all of the melachas, right? That if you only do one melacha, you're not chayiv. You have to do all 39 melachas in order to be chayiv. So don't say that. Rather, right? Don't kindle a flame in all of wherever you are on Shabbos. So meaning even just kindling alone, you'd be chayiv kares or chayiv korban chatas if it was by accident. But we don't have to do all of the melachas in order for the obligation to the chiyuv to kick in. It kicks in even after an individual sort of violation. So let's start over. Right, so it says, I mean, it takes me avar, may have thought to say from avar, the tanan to bishmal, lo sevayesh b'chomosh v'seichem atam lomer. How come the pasuk says, don't kindle a flame wherever you are on Shabbos? Matam lomer, ilu Reb Yossi lelav, ilu Reb Nosson lechalik. To which the Gemara says, what do you mean? Why does it say lo sevayesh? I mean, this has already been asked before. And the reason is, according to Reb Yossi, it's to teach that kindling is only a lav. According to Reb Nosson, it's to teach that lechalik, that you're chayiv for each and every individual melacha that you do. You don't have to do all 50 of them. The Tanya, as we learned by Savar lelav yotzos, to Reb Yossi Reb Nosson om lechalik. Reb Yossi says that avar lelav yotzos, and Reb Yossi says lechalik yotzos. V'omer Rav, it says Rav Tana Moshavos Kakashale. And Rav says no. The Brisa is not asking about why does it say Lo Sivaru Eish. That's not why it's asking. I know it's Machlokas Reb Yossi and Reb Nosson, fine. It's asking about what's pshat with B'chomosh Voseichen. What's pshat with wherever you're in all of your dwellings. Moshavos Matam Ulomer. Why do we have to say don't kindle a flame wherever you live? Mirde Shabbos Chovas Agufi. After all, Sabbath is an obligation on one's body as opposed to on the land, right? Meaning, for example, when, Trumas and Meisters, That stuff that is dependent on growing from the ground, shmita, things like that, right? Stuff that's dependent on the ground, and that's limited to Eretz Yisrael. But something like Shabbos, that is nothing, it's on each and every person. And a obligation on one's body, on oneself, so that is relevant wherever you are, whether you're in Eretz Yisrael, whether you're in Chutz La'aretz. And therefore, when it says, so therefore, what they're asking about in the Brisa is, when it says, why does it have to tell us, don't kindle a flame wherever you are, whether in Eretz Yisrael or Chutz La'aretz? I know that Shabbos is a chovas haguf. It's on a fellow, it's on an individual, wherever that individual might be. So Moshavos the cause of Achmona b'Shabbos Lomali. So why do I need it to say Moshavos? Of course, Shabbos applies everywhere. So Mishum b'Shmuel Omar Talmud Echad. So a certain student said, quoting where it said from Rabbi Shmuel, Lefi shenemar, because we have a pasuk that says B'chiyeh b'ish chet mishmat mavis v'humos, because it talks about in the context of capital punishment that if you have a fellow who did something that he needs to be killed for and he's killed, so i.e. misas bezdin. So it says that, right, V'chiyeh ish b'ish chet mishpat mavis v'humos, that if you have a fellow who's deserving to capital punishment, so you kill him. Shomei ani bein b'chol ben b'Shabbos. The implication being, you kill him whenever you have to kill him, whether it's a weekday, whether it's Shabbos. Says v'humos, he's got to die. But what about the pasuk that says that anybody who transgresses Shabbos needs to be killed, i.e., don't violate Shabbos, don't be killing people on Shabbos. So b'shar melachos chutz mimisas bezdin. So I could say that, well, maybe that's talking about by other melachos, not misas bezdin, right? So on the one hand it says I'm repeating, right, that on the one hand it says you have to kill the guy. So that sounds like maybe it's even on Shabbos. But then what about Mechalel Mos Yumos? What about the fact that you don't do malach on Shabbos? Certainly you don't kill people on Shabbos. So maybe that's talking about other malachas, but misas bezdin you would do on Shabbos. Or enu ela afilu misas bezdin. Or maybe what it's saying is Mechalel Mos Yumos, that anybody who violates Shabbos is chayv misa, i.e., don't do any malach on Shabbos, even misas bezdin. But then what do you do with the pasuk? It says v'humas, that if he's obligated to receive a capital punishment, then he has to be killed. So b'chol v'lo b'Shabbos, you could say that's talking about during the weekday, but not on Shabbos. Okay, fine. And then the Gemara sort of interestingly, and the Gemara is going to come back to that a little bit later. But it says, Oenu Ella, it sort of like goes back to the first argument. Oenu Ella afilu b'Shabbos. Or maybe it means that even on Shabbos, you would do capital punishment. Talmud Lomar, therefore the pasuk says, Lo sivayu eish b'chomosh v'oseichem. Therefore, the pasuk says, do not kindle a flame in all of your dwellings. Ulahalanu omer, and it says later on, V'hayu eile lachem l'chukas mishpat l'doroseichem b'chomosh v'oseichem. And it says also in the context of capital punishment, it says of rotzeach, of a murder. It says, and this will be for you a statute for all of your generations, wherever you may live. Ma'moshavos amurim lahalon bebezdin, af moshavos amurim kan bebezdin. So just like it says moshavos, right? It says, right, just like in the context of capital punishment of killers and misas bezdin, it says moshvosechem, right? And it says also moshvosechem by Shabbos, so moshvosechem, so moshavos amurim lahalon bebezdin, just like the moshavos that's mentioned in the context of Rotzeach, it's talking about Misas Bezdin, Af Moshavos Amurim Kan Bezdin. So also the Moshavos in the context of Shabbos is talking about Misas Bezdin, to say that you would not do Misas Bezdin on Shabbos. So it says, Lo Savaris B'chol Mosh Vosechim B'yom Shabbos. The whole point of saying Mosh Vosechim, of course, is not to teach me that Shabbos is wherever you live. I know that it's a chovas haguf. Rather, it's to teach me that even Misas Bezdin is not dokhe Shabbos, that even though the pasuk says v'humos, nonetheless, you do not kill on Shabbos, because Mechalel Mos Yumos, and because it says Moshavos. That's how we know that even Misas Bezdin is not dokhe Shabbos. Okay? From Rachmana lo Sivaru, and the pasuk says, right, do not kindle, i.e., you're not going to be mechalel Shabbos for Misas Bezdin. And now here comes the proof, friends. So my love, Reb Nosani, dom lechalek yotzasa. So now here we go. So let's say that this is according to Reb Nosin, who says that havara lelav yotzos, that havara. No, that's Reb Yossi, right? No, so Reb Nosin do amar lechalek yotzasa, right? That this is Reb Nosin who says that the reason why we specify havara, even though it says lo sahsay kol melacha, don't do any melacha, and then we have lo sivaris b'chomosh v'seichem, we single out havara. So says Reb Nosin lechalek, to say that even just for havara, even just for one melacha, you're going to be chayiv karis on Shabbos. So we see that according to Reb Nosin, so havara lechalek yotzos, which means that you're going to be chayiv karis for havara, and nonetheless, we seem to be saying that if not for the fact, so let's go weiter. And the reason why I know that you're not allowed to kindle on Shabbos is because the pasuk says lo sivaru. Do not, meaning in the context of Misas Bezdin, do not kindle a flame in the context of Misas Bezdin, because even though you have a humos, which is a positive commandment, but, and of course there's a negative commandment of lo sahsay kol melacha, which is a chiyuv karis, nonetheless, we seem to be saying lo sivaru, right? Lo sivaru. Don't say that the Ahsay of Yevamos is dokhe the lo ta'asay of not doing melacha on Shabbos, but specifically because the pasuk says lo sivaru, because the pasuk says even though you have the mitzvah Ahsay of Yevamos and you have the lo ta'asay of doing melacha on Shabbos, and therefore I would assume that the Ahsay of the Yevamos would be dokhe the lo ta'asay of Shabbos, which is a chiyuv karis associated with it. Nonetheless, lo sivaru. Do not kindle. Don't. Do not kindle, even though there's this Ahsay. But by default, I would say that the Ahsay is dokhe the lo ta'asay, and therefore we see that Ahsay is dokhe lo ta'asay even in the context of karis. Okay. Fine, so Yotzav the time of the cause of Achmana lo sivaru. The reason why we know that don't pay attention to the Ahsay is because it says lo sivaru, specifically do not kindle, and we said that Moshe Vosechem is talking about Misas Bezdin. So even though there's an Ahsay of Misas Bezdin, it's not dokhe lo ta'asay. But by default, halavachi, by default, I would have thought dachi that the Ahsay would be dokhe lo ta'asay. And says the Gemara lo Reb Yossi. No, so I'm sorry. So Gemara says lo Reb Yossi. So the Gemara says, no, it's not actually, right, meaning this would only be a proof if it's Reb Nosin, who says that havara lechalek yotzos, and therefore havara as a chiyuv kares, and therefore if we're saying that by default, we would say that the Ahsay of Yevamos would be dokhe the lo ta'asay. So then we're saying that Ahsay is dokhe lo ta'asay even in the context of kares. We say no, but lo, it's Reb Yossi. We're saying it's Reb Yossi, havara lelav yotzos, and havara is just a regular lav, and therefore it's not necessarily teaching us. It's not teaching us that Ahsay would theoretically be dokhe lo ta'asay by default. It'd only be in the context of a regular lo ta'asay of a lav, but not about a chiyuv kares like Reb Nosim would say. But b'tavinami Reb Yossi. But let's say 1 second. Even according to Reb Yossi, nonetheless, in the context of Misas Bezdin, we would be talking about in Av Melacha. Because Eimer to Amr Reb Yossi havara lelav yotzasa havara gredasa. Let's say that when Reb Yossi says that havara, that kindling, is only a lav, that's when it's just kindling. But havara de Bezdin bishul psilahu. But the kindling in the context of Misas Bezdin, right, when we have sreifa, when we burn somebody to death, So it's that we pour hot lead down their throat and it burns out their insides. And therefore, the kindling that would take place in Bezdin, in the context of Misas Bezdin, would be, cooking the lead in order to pour it down the fellow's throat, which is actually bishul, which is an av malachos. So even according to Rabbi Yossi, who says, sure, avar lelav yotzisa, but nonetheless, in the context of Bezdin, which is what we learn up from B'chol Moshe V'Seichem, that we're talking about Misas Bezdin, you would actually have to cook up the lead, in which case it would be an av melacha, and therefore even according to Rabbi Yossi, who says, avar lelav yotzisa, in the context of Misas Bezdin, it would actually be an av melacha, and therefore even according to Rabbi Yossi, if we're assuming that the default is that V'humas would override lo sevayu, it would even be a chiyuv kares, and therefore, even if it's according to Rabbi Yossi, still, we would be assuming that the Ahsay of Yevamos would be dokhe the lot Ahsay that has a chiyuv kares associated with it. From Rav Sheshes, and says Rav Sheshes, mali bishul psila, mali bishul samonin, that what's the difference if I'm, cooking lead to pour down somebody's throat, or if I'm cooking the herbs that I think we needed for dyes or something like that. So therefore it would be regular, just kind of cooking. So even according to Yossi, if you're kind of cooking up the lead for Misas Bezdin, it would be a chiyuv kares, and still we're saying that the assumption is that we would say that Ahsay is dokhe lo tasay, even when there's a chiyuv kares. Fine. No. So here we go. So we seem to be saying that maybe this could be the proof that Ahsay, that the assumption is that an Ahsay is dokhe lo tasay, even when there is a chiyuv kares, and just because the pasuk specifically says lo sevayu eish, that is why I know that we don't say that Ahsay of V'humas is dokhe lo tasay, but by default I would assume that it is. Amr of Shimon bar Ashi, Aitana lo mishum da'asi esef dokhe lo sahsay. Says Rav Shimon bar Ashi, no, you have it all wrong. It's not that I would have thought that the Ahsay of V'humas is dokhe the lo tasay of lo sevayu eish, of don't cook the lead. No, it's not that. This isn't a question of Ahsay dokhe lo tasay, and then the pasuk is coming to say that don't do it. That's not what we're talking about. Ela mishum demaisi mikav v'chomer. Rather, I may have made a logical argument to say that Misas Bezdin should be dokhe Shabbos. V'achi komer. This is what it means. What does it mean that those who desecrate the Sabbath are chayiv misa? I.e., what would be the argument to say that I should not do Misas Bezdin on Shabbos? B'shar melachos chutz mi Misas Bezdin. That would be talking about other melachos not to do on Shabbos. Ava Misas Bezdin dokhe Shabbos mikal v'chomer. But I would argue that Misas Bezdin should be dokhe Shabbos because of the following reason. Uma'avoda shi chamura v'doche Shabbos, because if after all doing the service in the temple is doche Shabbos, right? We bring the korban tamid, bring other korbanos on Shabbos. So if doing the service in the temple is doche Shabbos, and yet ritzicha doche osa, and yet if somebody is obligated to, we have to kill a fellow, he needs to get capital punishment. So we say, even if he's a kohen, he's going to go do avoda. No, we chop him and we kill him. That from my altar, take him to die. Meaning, if he's chayiv misa, if he's chayiv misa's bezin, even if he's a kohen, he's going to be doing avoda, you still kill him. So we see that avoda is more stringent than Shabbos, because avoda is dokhe Shabbos, and misa's bezdin is more stringent than avoda, because we'll kill even a kohen on his way to avoda. So Shabbos shenidches v'pnei avoda einu din shetei ritzicha dokhe osa. So then Shabbos, which seems to be sort of on the bottom of this chain, right? Because avoda is dokhe Shabbos, Misas Bezdin is dokhe avoda. Shabbos is all the way at the bottom of the chain. So certainly then, Misas Bezdin should be dokhe Shabbos. So certainly then, I would think that Misas Bezdin should be dokhe Shabbos. Because after all, Misas Bezdin is dokhe avoda, which is dokhe Shabbos. So umay o einu dekamer. So then, what's the reverse argument? Hachi kamar. This is what it's saying. First, meis mitzvah tochiach. Well, what about the concept of a meis mitzvah, right? That if you find somebody, sort of in the middle of nowhere, and there's nobody to bury him, so you have to bury him. Dokhe avoda, that it overrides avoda, ve'ein dokhe Shabbos, and yet it is not dokhe Shabbos. Right, the burying of a meis mitzvah. If you find somebody and you need him to, and you have to bury him, so that overrides avoda. Right, if you're going to go, right, we've learned, I think, a few times Masechta Brachos, maybe Masechta Psachim, that if you're on your way, like to offer your korban pesach, and you find a meis mitzvah, so then you take care of the meis mitzvah. So burying of a meis mitzvah is dokhe avoda, and of course avoda is dokhe Shabbos, and yet the burying of the meis mitzvah is not dokhe Shabbos, and therefore I can make the argument to say that also misas bezdin, even though it's dokhe avoda, it would not be dokhe Shabbos, just like meis mitzvah is not dokhe Shabbos. Hadar Amar, and then the Bryce went on to say, but one second, maybe kvos mitzvah tidcha Shabbos. Then we thought to say, wait, but maybe burying a meis mitzvah should be dokhe Shabbos, because after all, mikav v'chomer, it's logical, avoda she dokhe Shabbos, if during the service in the temple is dokhe Shabbos, kvos meis mitzvah dokhe osa, and burying a meis mitzvah is dokhe avoda, right? So therefore you have avoda is dokhe Shabbos, meis mitzvah is dokhe avoda. So Shabbos seems to be at the bottom of the chain. So how do I know that meis mitzvah is dokhe avoda from the fact that it says achoso, right? It says le'aviv le'imo le'achav le'achoso. It says by a Kohen that he can't be tummy to any of them, and we learn out different things from each one. From Blachos we learn out that a meis mitzvah is dokhe avoda. So Shabbos shenidches mipnei avoda enu din shetei kvos meis mitzvah dokhe osa. So then I would think that certainly then, if avoda is dokhe Shabbos, meis mitzvah is dokhe avoda, so then certainly meis mitzvah should be dokhe Shabbos. So then we say nonetheless, lo sivaru. We say, no, do not kindle a flame b'chol moshvosechem. We said moshavos in the context of Shabbos, and moshavos in the context of misas bezdin. So just like moshavos over there is in the context of misas bezdin, also lo svaru eish on Shabbos is the context of misas bezdin. We're saying don't do misas bezdin on Shabbos. So therefore, we had the havminah to say that misas bezdin should be dokhe Shabbos. And then we said maybe it's not because of meis mitzvah. Then we said maybe meis mitzvah should be dokhe Shabbos. To which you said, look, we have this pasuk of lo sevar eish b'chol moshvosechem, do not do misas bezdin on Shabbos. The point being that therefore what the Brisa is talking about there, it's not talking about Ahsay dokhe lo tasay. Rather, it's saying that I would have had a thought to make a kav v'chomer to argue that misas bezdin should be dokhe Shabbos. Therefore, we have lo sevar eish to say that misas bezdin is not dokhe Shabbos. However, it's not that without the pasuk I would have thought that Ahsay dokhe lo tasay. No, without the pasuk I would have thought to make a kav v'chomer to say that misas bezdin should be dokhe Shabbos. So it's not a proof to say Ahsay dokhe lo tasay. Friends, that was the Vav of Masechta Yevamos. What do we learn on the Vav? So we are continuing our search to find the verse that we could sort of assume from it that Ahsay would be dokhe lo tasay even in the context of a chiyuv kares, like by yibum, where sleeping with one's wife's sister is a chiyuv kares. We tried to learn it out from kibud av ha'em, to say that kibud av ha'em, the Torah needs to specifically say that if your father or mother can command you to be mechal Shabbos, do not listen to them. But by default, I would have thought that you should listen to them to be mechal Shabbos, even though it's a chiyuv kares, because Ahsay dokhe lo tasay, even in the context of a chiyuv kares. But we said over there that ultimately we can't learn out from there, because by kibud av ha'em, it's a situation where in order to be mekayim the mitzvah saseh kibud av ha'em, you have to do what your parents said, which is to slaughter an animal or to cook on Shabbos, which is what you're going to be chayiv kares for. So therefore, in that context, memele, there's no way out, right? And in order, the only way to do the Ahsay would be also to be violating the lo tasay. So in that case, yes, I would have the havminah to say by default that Ahsay dokhe lo tasay even in the context of kares. However, by our case of yibum, there's a way out, which is just do chalitza and avoid those situations. So maybe in that case we would not say Ahsay dokhe lo tasay. Then we tried to prove it from lo suvaru eish b'chol moshvosechem. Right, we referenced the machlokas between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Nosson. Rabbi Yossi says havara lilav yotzos. Rabbi Nosson says havara lechalek yotzos. And then we want to say that the Torah specifically has to say, Lo sevar eish b'chol moshvosechem, and that's specifically talking about Misas Bezdin. And because we say from Moshavos, that to say that Los Varios B'chol Moshvosechem is talking about Misas Bezdin, and the pasuk is specifically saying that we don't do Misas Bezdin on Shabbos, but that's specifically because the pasuk is saying not to do Misas Bezdin. But by default, I would assume that we would do Misas Bezdin on Shabbos. And we want to say that that's because I would say Ahsay is dokhe Ahsay, even in the context of Kares, to which Rav Shimon Bar Ashi said, no, it's not that the default would have been to assume that Ahsay is dokhe Ahsay even in the context of Kares. No, the point is I would have thought that by default I would make the logical argument to say, well, if Avoda is dokhe Shabbos and Misas Bezdin is dokhe Avoda, then Memela Misas Bezdin should be dokhe Shabbos. I would have had the Havminah to say that Kavachomer. Therefore, it says that Lo Sevar Eish B'chol Moshvosechem, which is talking about Misas Bezdin, that we don't do Misas Bezdin on Shabbos. But it is not necessarily a proof to say that Ahsay is dokhe Ahsay in the context of a Chiyuv Kares. Friends, that was Daf Vav Masech Yevamos. It was definitely an involved daf, but I still think it was pretty gishmak. Peace out.